Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. In previous episodes we discussed the opportunist architectural trends of rationalism, also known as formalism, led by the ASNOVA organization, and constructivism, also known as functionalism, led by the OSA organization. In this episode we'll cover the two remaining tendencies, the so-called proletarian architects of Vopra and bourgeois classicists. Then we can determine why none of these trends was sufficient and why socialist realism was necessary. Soviet architect Alabyan writes, quote, "The party set us the task of critically studying the classical heritage and all the best that modern architecture has created. This slogan became a work program for the broad masses of Soviet architects, playing a huge positive role in their creative restructuring. However, some architects understood this most important slogan incorrectly and one-sidedly. Architects Goltz, Sobolev, Kozin, Barsh, Parushkinov, and some others took the wrong path of mechanically transferring classical architectural forms into their works. Goltz, for example, in his project for the Agricultural Exhibition Pavilion, and Sobolev in his design for the fountain for Sochi, completely uncritically used individual elements of Renaissance architecture, Pompeii. That's why they produced false, cold, pseudo-classical works. In pursuit of abstract mastery, they forgot about our era, about the people for whom they build. We must learn from Brunellesco, Palladio, Bramante and other great architects of the Renaissance on how to master cultural heritage, using the best examples of architecture from ancient Greece and Rome. These masters created their own special style that corresponded to the spirit of their time. They did not follow the path of simply repeating ancient architectural forms, but managed to fill these forms with new content, new architectural techniques. The architectural monuments of the Renaissance do not resemble either the Athenian Acropolis or the Roman Colosseum and Forum. By deeply studying the monuments of ancient Greek and Roman architecture, they were able to creatively rework this valuable heritage in order to arrive at completely different volumetric and spatial solutions for their works, to create new architectural images corresponding to the new era. We still have many architects who turn to the classical heritage only to find in it ready-made motives to enrich their wretched architectural language. The result is a chaotic mixture of shapes and details of different styles. Eclectic illegibility is the result not only of a low level of skill, a lack of professional culture, but also, mainly, of the unprincipled architect, his lack of a correct understanding of the tasks of Soviet architecture." Unquote. That's a very good explanation. We've talked about it before. I also find it interesting that those architects who only used classical forms as basically just empty ornamentation with no content, they turn into eclectics. Eclectic architecture was a style that prevailed in Russia in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Eclecticism basically just meant that classical forms, which look cool, were separated from their context and separated from their function and their content. So somebody might say like, okay, I want some Greek stuff, I also like some Egyptian stuff, so give me a couple of columns, why don't you give me a couple of sphinxes or something, and you know, maybe some like Russian medieval stuff. Those are all kind of classical elements, but they just turn into this jumble. So eclecticism is actually kind of fake classicism. But of course, it's also possible to mechanically reuse classical models even without doing it eclectically. Bazdyrev writes, quote, "Classicism was the main style that Soviet architects addressed, but the party insisted that the forms polished by thousands of years of human history be filled with new socialist content. Absence of a theory of socialist realism was felt sharply." So this is obviously referring to the era before socialist realism was established. "Positive requirements for new architecture were not clearly outlined. Sometimes even the leading Soviet architectural designers were subjected to criticism. I.V. Zholtovsky for so-called restorationism, that is, literal copying of classical style techniques. A.V. Skutsev for eclecticism, uncritical combination of styles from different epochs. Yes, by overcoming the diseases of growth, the architectural method of socialist realism was strengthening and crystallizing." Unquote. So there you can see, even though Skutsev, he's the architect who designed the Lenin Mausoleum, so he was considered the best Soviet architect, the most highly awarded and whatnot. and also Zholtovsky, who was another very highly regarded Soviet architect. They both came from a classicist background. Skutsev also did other styles. He did constructivism too, and also eclecticism. He kind of did whatever, because he was a bourgeois architect originally. It was his job before the October Revolution. And Zholtovsky also, but Zholtovsky's specialty was being a super expert when it comes to the Renaissance. So Zholtovsky wasn't doing any eclectic stuff. He was doing everything super authentic, like it had to be exactly the way it was in the Renaissance. Because Zholtovsky was so good at doing everything exactly the way the Renaissance masters had done it, he easily fell into mechanically just copying classic models. Not only the Renaissance, but still the Renaissance was his specialty. So nobody was safe from criticism. Even these people who can nowadays be considered the best of the best, and even at the time who the Soviet government and the Communist Party considered to be the best of the best, they still received warranted criticism. And the criticism also didn't mean that their career just ended or that they were put in prison or something. No, they just received criticism and then they were expected to improve their work, which most of these people were very capable of doing. Chapenko writes, quote, "Exposing the nihilistic attitude of constructivism to architecture's rich heritage, especially towards the classics, could push an immature artist to the other extreme, the persistent reproduction of historical forms, their superficial interpretation. Some architects went this way. Their protest against constructivism, the desire for valuable architectural form, found expression in a return to the previous styles without serious reflection on the fact that replacing constructivism cannot be done by reducing architecture to mechanical use of heritage," unquote. And, quote, "Skill to distinguish what is valuable and progressive in folk art from what is regressive and obsolete is especially important. Without this quality, turning to heritage inevitably leads to restorationism or eclecticism," unquote. That's key, because even though Marxism says that we should use and build upon past tradition, it only means progressive tradition. So whatever is reactionary should be discarded. There's plenty of stuff in antiquity that should be discarded because it was a slave-owning society. And even from the Renaissance, because the Renaissance was still a class society. Quote, "In the talk entitled Architecture of a Residential Apartment Building, given at the first All-Union Congress of Soviet Architects in 1937 by architects G.A. Simonov and A.G. Mordvinov, after criticizing aesthetic nihilism, they went on to discuss mechanical use of classical forms. Touching upon the subject of interior architecture, the speakers expressed their disapproval of those architects who added such unnecessary, in their opinion, architectural elements as columns, pilasters, and intricate moldings in small apartments, wanting to create an impression of some kind of palace. The latter was a criticism of decorations for their own sake, with no regard for the conveniences of the apartment dwellers. However, it was not a criticism of the entire idea of decorations. For example, the speakers suggested practical ways to improve production of such elements of architectural decor as cornices, rosettes, and plafonds. In conjunction with their criticism of excessive embellishments in interior architecture, they added, this doesn't, of course, in the smallest degree mean a rejection of sculptural and other decorations in apartments," unquote. We've also talked about that before, but that's kind of the same idea that if it's a small apartment, in most cases there's probably no point in putting like Greek columns in your bathroom or like your small kitchen or something. It has to fit the purpose, it has to fit the size of the building. Like, columns are usually monumental, so they are intended for big public buildings to demonstrate monumentality. If it's just a cozy little home, Greek columns don't have any place in there. You can have decorations, but it should be something else, something more fitting. You know, imagine if in your living room you had a sphinx or some kind of Arc de Triomphe. How about an obelisk? You know, those are supposed to be huge, they're supposed to be monumental, it just doesn't fit in that context. Zholtovsky said in 1950, "When studying and using the classics, one should not blindly copy its external forms. In your creative work, you should strive to comprehend a system that leads to a classical solution to a given problem. Working with antique details and mechanically repeating them does not mean following the precepts of the classics. On the contrary, such a path inevitably leads to eclecticism and formalism, unquote. So he himself, of course, especially later on, was well aware of this. Formalism in this case just means, all form and no content, just decoration, no function. But Zholtovsky himself, from time to time, received criticism for formalism. I've talked about this in previous episodes too. And then also for cosmopolitanism, which means rejecting the national form, because it was said that he just ignores the local culture that he's working with, typically the Russian, and only wants to use so-called universal Greco-Roman models. And Zholtovsky also, especially earlier on, because of his bourgeois background, received criticism. He was basically a bourgeois specialist, and at first he didn't really want to and wasn't really able to accept party guidance and make criticism and self-criticism. Later he was able to, but not initially. Hudson writes, quote, Vesnin had publicly condemned the party's call for beauty as a slogan for the establishment of Philistinism, for the implanting of reaction in architecture. So this is of course because constructivism is aesthetically nihilist, so when the party said that we have to have aesthetic values, constructivists disagreed. But anyway, Hudson continues. In this denial of the party's competency, Vesnin was joined by others with bourgeois specialist tendencies. Ivan Fomin had gone so far as to slander the party by claiming that it repressed architects and denied them creative freedom. Vesnin, Fomin and Skutsev, Alexandrov exclaimed, all were seeking to escape party and proletariat leadership and had to be given a decisive rebuff, unquote. Fomin and Skutsev were both mostly classicist architects, especially Fomin. Skutsev had more variety, and then Vesnin was a constructivist. And because they had been pretty successful architects before the revolution, they were pretty well-to-do, they were basically bourgeois experts. They initially kinda rebelled against the party and complained that the party shouldn't criticize them, the party shouldn't give them tasks. Various pseudo-classicists, such as theorist A.G. Gabrichevsky, also received heavy criticism from Marxist architect Chapenko. Chapenko says that Gabrichevsky's position was totally formalist, using idealistic philosophy to justify his position that architecture is pure art, meaning non-ideological art, which doesn't need to serve the people, shouldn't have any kind of message. Of course, that's not true. Pure art, or art for art's sake, is bourgeois, but they claim that it's non-ideological, and they claim that it shouldn't serve any kind of purpose. And Gabrichevsky also claimed that architectural forms are separated from history and separated from society, which of course is reactionary and idealist. So as a result, Gabrichevsky was fired from his teaching post and also criticized for cosmopolitanism in 1949. Gabrichevsky, being an old bourgeois expert, had also been arrested and exiled several times in the 1920s and 30s in connection with various counter-revolutionary plots that he was involved with. Anti-communists usually claim that cosmopolitanism is just some kind of veiled anti-Semitism, but so far from what we've been reading here, Gabrichevsky, Zholtovsky, and also Vesnin were criticized for cosmopolitanism, but they're all Russian, none of them is Jewish. Alabyan also makes an interesting point. He says, quote, Gigantomania is also caused by a false understanding of the tasks of critical development of the best examples of Russian architectural heritage. So, for example, when reconstructing cities, we often take a very simplified approach to wonderful old, long-established architectural ensembles. This can be illustrated by the experience of the same Leningrad. For example, architects Rudnev, Levinson, Ohl, and some others, wanting to shout out the best monuments of past centuries, are planting monstrous colonnades and other completely unjustified super-monumental forms all over the place. Of course, it is much easier to stand in a proud pose and challenge, say Rastrelli, Zaharov, or another great master, than to carefully study their rich cultural heritage, so that the best elements of it are not reduced to nothing, but on the contrary are used critically and emphasized as much as possible in your own works, unquote. So yeah, Gigantomania was just basically building things super big, what he calls super monumentalism, which is also wrong because you have to take the situation into account, you have to take the environment into account. You can't just build some kind of huge, totally oversized building that just sticks out like a sore thumb. This actually is something that happens nowadays with reactionary bourgeois architecture. Some architects just build something that totally doesn't fit into the landscape, either because it just looks so weird or because it's so huge. And especially because it's often a competition, like all the reactionary architects nowadays, they just want to stand out, they want to do something that looks different and interesting. And also various corporations, they all want to have the largest, the tallest skyscraper, so that they can draw attention to themselves and overshadow everybody else. And this is also what, in a previous episode, I think it was the constructivism episode, when I talked about Leonidov, his designs also had this kind of gigantomania kind of aspect. So to summarize, as we've stated already many times, bourgeois classicism wasn't just accepted as is. Classical elements were used, but socialist realism is not the same as bourgeois classicism. I'm not going to really go into that again because I've talked about it so many times in previous episodes. Those bourgeois experts who weren't able to adapt were criticized. Just because somebody was doing classicism didn't mean that they were immune from criticism. They could be called an eclectic. They could even be called a formalist, which you maybe wouldn't immediately think, because all the modernist schools are of course formalist, but you can even do classicism in a formalist way. And they could also be criticized for cosmopolitanism, because even if you do classicism, you can still do it while ignoring the national form of art. So anyway, then let's get to Vopra, the so-called proletarian architects. Ikonnikov writes, quote, "The situation initially tended to pull the existing groups of architects further apart. New associations had come into being, offering their architectural ideas and methods, there being practically no doubts regarding the final social goals," meaning that they all agreed that they want to build socialism. In 1928, Ladovsky and his closest followers left ASNOVA to set up the Association of Urbanist Architects, ARU. The All-Russia Association of Proletarian Architects, Vopra, came into being during the same year and included such architects as Karo Alabyan, Alexander Vlasov, Arkady Mordvinov, and Vasily Zimbirtsev. Vopra leveled scathing criticisms at the credos of the constructivists and rationalists, imputing to them a naive technicism, neglect of the aesthetic arrangement of the environment, a specificity of the architectural images, an abandonment of the actual tasks of urban development. Albeit largely justified, the criticism was somewhat made in overly sharp language. Although it asserted the need for a more direct response to society's requirements, including the need to embody its aspirations and ideals in architecture, Vopra's positive platform nevertheless remained an abstract declaration of intent, unquote. They could criticize, but they couldn't really do it any better than their rivals. And that's kind of a constant theme with Vopra. And Vopra also emphasized that you had to be a communist, you had to have a class outlook, and also that what you were doing had to be very practical, it had to be practice-oriented, had to be involved in building socialism. That's all fine and good, but we'll get into it more. So, Mikhailov, a Soviet architect, writes, quote, "In its subsequent speeches, Vopra repeatedly emphasized the difference between OSA constructivists as the fellow traveler group closest to proletarian architects, ASNOVA, or rationalist formalists, which also made it possible to talk about fellow traveler tendencies, and eclectics, in particular the Moscow Architectural Society, representing the most reactionary layers on the architectural front. In particular, while fighting against reactionary bourgeois trends in architecture, and above all against eclectics and restorationists, Vopra raised the question of a united front in the process of this struggle before OSA and ASNOVA," unquote. So Vopra's idea was that they considered classicism to be the worst of all tendencies, kind of because of a very vulgar understanding of class, because the Moscow Architectural Society, which was mainly classicist, was a pre-revolutionary organization and the people in it were bourgeois experts. So therefore, Vopra says, okay, this is a bourgeois organization, they want to do classicism, which is an old bourgeois style, therefore it's the worst, while formalism and constructivism are new trends, kind of petty bourgeois, ultra-radical trends, who, at least in words, say that they want to build socialism. So therefore, Vopra considered that they need to make a united front between all the new organizations, ASNOVA, OSA, and Vopra, against the classicist organization. However, bourgeois writer Khazanova writes, quote, "In fact, the ideas of Vopra and OSA or the constructivists, were very similar, but they were impatient and intolerant, and this led to much disagreement and ineffectual discussion, unquote. When the Soviet government organized a competition for the design of the new Lenin library, the classicists won the competition. It was Zhukov's design which won. So all the modernists criticized it. Udo Selb writes, quote, "Obviously, reflecting the Moscow Party Committee's quote-unquote right orientation, Stroitelstvo Moskvy, the official magazine of the City Hall, published a formal protest signed by the leading modernist architectural societies, OSA, so Society of Contemporary Architects or Constructivists, and ASNOVA, Association of New Architecture, or Formalists, which mutated into ARU in November 1928, unquote. And the so-called proletarian architects of Vopra also joined the criticism. So, quote, Vopra joined the protest against the result of the Lenin Library competition in favor of the Friedman project. Despite its advocacy of an imaginary proletarian architecture, Vopra's members were still practicing constructivist architecture, unquote. So here you can see that, as Udo Selb says, although Vopra claimed that it was very different from these other modernists, they were still practicing constructivism even if they attacked it in theory or in ideology. And, you know, when the party and the government say, okay, this classical design is better, all the Trotskyists and whatnot of OSA, they criticize it, but Vopra, even though they say that they're not Trotskyists, they support the Soviet government and whatnot, they still also join in the criticism. So they end up in this weird situation where the government and the party increasingly favor classicism, but Vopra, even though it considers itself super communist, and in a way Vopra was like completely orthodox, like ASNOVA and OSA could be considered Trotskyist, but Vopra wasn't. But they still end up with major disagreements with the government just because they're modernist. Soviet architect Kohli writes, quote, "The Vopra declaration, which called for the struggle for class proletarian architecture, gave in general a correct criticism of the then state of the architectural front, castigating unprincipled opportunistic eclecticism, formalism and constructivism, but the positive program of the Vopraists was formulated much less clearly, specifically and intelligibly. In this program, Vopra interpreted the method of dialectical materialism as applied to architecture in a simplified and sometimes vulgar way. Having posed the problem of mastering the cultural heritage, Vopra was unable, however, to reveal what the critical mastery of the architectural heritage consists of, not only its program but also in its practical work. While verbally fighting against formalism and constructivism, the Vopraists in their own projects actually overcame neither one nor the other. Their projects were difficult to distinguish from purely formalist or constructivist works. True, this does not exclude the fact that Vopra united many fresh talented forces who, through successful participation in competitions, often moved to the forefront of architecture," unquote. I think that's a perfect way of describing it. And this raises a very interesting and fundamental political issue. You can have a correct theory, but if you don't implement it, then what happens? Vopra says in words that yes, we should critically master and critically apply the progressive heritage, we should use national form, we should criticize constructivism, whatnot. They say that, but they don't really understand what it means. They haven't really taken it to heart. Because even though they say it, they fail to implement it. They fail to do it. They say that they have to critically apply progressive tradition, but in actual practice they reject all tradition. They say they have to criticize constructivism, but in actual practice they're unable to do anything else besides just stuff that is constructivist or looks exactly like constructivist. And this kind of thing, of course, doesn't only apply to architecture. There's some people who they criticize revisionism. They say, oh yeah, I don't like revisionism, but then in actual practice they might still follow it. Or even more common, the most common of these kinds of things I think is when people say that they oppose reformism, but then their practice is still completely reformist. Because it's one way to say it and another way to do it. Because Vopra understood that those things were the correct things to say, but they didn't really understand what it means more deeply. Just like people know that reformism is bad, so they know to say that reformism is bad, but they don't understand it any more deeply than that. They don't know what it actually means or how to actually put it into practice. And I'm not saying that I'm immune to it either. Nobody is immune to it. So, in a way, you might think Vopra is an organization which calls itself proletarian. The members of Vopra are all communists. Many of them, if not all of them, are party members. The party often relied on them for various things. Why did Vopra not become the dominant organization? Well, for all these various reasons that we just discussed, Vopra itself did not survive the debates in the architectural sphere, and when all the existing organizations were merged into the Union of Soviet Architects, Vopra was also merged into the Union of Soviet Architects, and Vopra's ideology did not become dominant. Instead, socialist realism became dominant. Khazanova writes, quote, "The party helped considerably towards the establishment of proletarian artists in the fields of fine arts and literature. Nevertheless, the extent of artistic activity was seriously handicapped by the variety of associations and the isolation of many groups, and soon it became evident that a new structure was required. In 1932, all architectural associations were united in the Union of Soviet Architects. Branches were established in all large cities. The first Congress of Soviet Architects took place in 1937, unquote. So to recap, Vopra had a bunch of good points, a bunch of good aspects to it. It introduced class ideology. Of course, the other new organizations tried to do it also. Constructivism was not entirely pro-Soviet. It emerged already before the revolution, but pretty quickly the entirely bourgeois and anti-revolutionary constructivists were kicked out. So constructivism, mainly in the Soviet Union, supported socialism, and they had a bunch of good points too. Rationalism also supported socialism. Their ideas weren't all terrible, but most of them were quite bad. Vopra was an advance from that. Just like the constructivists, they emphasized that we have to link our work with socialist construction, we have to be socially useful, but on top of that, they emphasized the idea of class struggle. Their kind of breakthrough was analyzing various architectural tendencies from a class point of view, from a class origin point of view. So they tried to look at, okay, the roots of this tendency are in idealism, the roots of that tendency are in petty bourgeois ideology or imperialism. They tried to actually apply Marxism to the analysis of various architectural trends, and that's why in previous videos I've also used a lot of Vopra materials. But Vopra made some vulgar Marxist mistakes, and its analysis of classicism is basically wrong. That's why Vopra is kinda ultra-leftist, and also it would be very interesting to analyze other fields too, like literature or music in the USSR, because this same exact thing also happened in all of those trends. In literature, there was the rap organization, RAPP, which was pretty notorious for its ultra-leftism. You know, if OSA is like the prolet cult organization, then Vopra is the RAPP organization. So Vopra, it claims that classicism is bourgeois and therefore should be rejected, but they don't realize that yes, classicism is bourgeois and it actually derives from even older pre-capitalist classical models from antiquity, but classicism and the classic antiquity were progressive for their time, and Marxism wants to use the progressive heritage by critically assimilating it, adapting it, refining it, and advancing it. In words, Vopra would probably agree with that statement, but they would still say that for some reason we need to reject all of classical heritage. So because of its flawed analysis, Vopra ended up in the total negation of all tradition, despite not attempting to do so. Vopra wasn't deliberately doing it the way, for example, ASNOVA was. But because Vopra rejected all of classicism, it then ended up in pure functionalism, the same thing that the constructivists were doing. And functionalism is just a monopoly, imperialist, bourgeois trend. So Vopra rejected classicism as bourgeois, because it comes from the time period when the bourgeoisie was an advanced class, but then Vopra just adopts the artistic ideology of not the advancing bourgeois, but the decadent imperialist bourgeois. So, you know, if you have to choose bourgeois classicism or bourgeois modernism, well, classicism is better. Not enough, but better. It's a foundation that you can advance from, whereas the ideology of the decadent imperialist bourgeois cannot be used as any kind of foundation. And then Vopra mistakenly considers functionalism to be a proletarian trend, but only socialist realism is a proletarian trend. The fact that Vopra considered functionalism to be proletarian art caused huge problems for it, because Vopra, OSA, and ASNOVA all criticized each other theoretically, but in terms of praxis, their constructions looked usually more or less the same. So Vopra couldn't really develop any kind of theory to guide their action. Their theory was one thing, but in practice it all looked the same, and therefore Vopra could only criticize others, but it couldn't put its own positive program into practice. It said, we have to build something truly different, truly proletarian, critically use tradition, use national forms, whatnot, but it all just looks constructivist in the end. Vopra couldn't develop socialist realism because it rejected classical forms so completely, and as a further result, it failed to implement Lenin's and Stalin's idea of national form and socialist content. Vopra actually had the right idea about socialist content, kind of similarly as constructivism, but maybe a little bit better. So yeah, in terms of function, in terms of content, okay, good. But in terms of how to implement the national form, they had no idea. Because if they use functionalism, how can these functionalist boxes have a national form? It's the same monotonous, imperialist, cosmopolitan stuff. It has nothing to do with the national form of any nation. But all that being said, the best representatives of Vopra, such as Alabyan and Mordvinov, they pretty quickly corrected their mistakes under the party's guidance and adopted socialist realism. Many bourgeois classicists were also able to do the same, so they also adopted socialist realism, mainly Skutsev and Zoltovsky, who actually became leading Soviet architects.